Welcome. My name is Gray Endres, and this is my colleague, Tara Wallace. This is a webinar for Strengthen Families, Rebuild Hope. The title of the webinar is Addressing the Foster Care Crisis in Kansas. Tara, tell me a little bit about yourself. I know you're a social worker. Let's let everybody know who you are, what do you do, what makes you tick.
Oh, I'm Tara Wallace. I am a social worker. I'm a licensed clinical social worker in Kansas. I have a private practice in Topeka. I'm also the president of the Topeka chapter of the Kansas African American Foster Care Adoption Coalition. And I served on the Governor's Child Welfare System Task Force Working Group. And what makes me tick? I have a heart for children and families. So the work that Strengthen Families, Rebuild Hope is very, very important to me, simply because this is the voice that those individuals don't have. And so I'm excited to be a part of anything that Strengthen Families, Rebuild Hope has going on.
Where did you go to school?
Washburn University. I graduated in 2013 from the School of Social Work at Washburn.
That's excellent. Well, my name's Gray Endres, and I am also an LSCSW and an LCSW in Missouri, and I'm a KU grad, so I got that going for me. And I have worked in child welfare in a variety of capacities since 1986. I did 16 years of residential care, and then I was discharged. That was good. And then I've done inpatient psych at Shawnee Mission Medical Center. I also co-own a private practice out of the Kansas City metropolitan area. Our kind of focus are kids in foster care that are being reunited or kids that are being adopted. I currently teach full-time at Missouri Western in the BSW program, and I'm an adjunct at KU. And I am completely insane and have almost halfway through my doctorate in social welfare from USC.
Awesome.
So if it doesn't kill me, that'll be good.
Awesome.
So today's webinar, which is a free webinar on ethics, you'll be able to get 1 hour of ethics CEUs. There are 4 objectives. And I do apologize. Most of this is going to be us having a discussion about 3 identified problems, a report that supports those problems, some evidence, and looking at very specific ethics within the Code of Ethics that these problems are treading on. So for the most part, it's going to flow really smoothly. But at this point, I'm apologizing up front. I'm going to have to look at my notes. So we are going to have 4 objectives. The first objective is we're going to introduce the 3 problems that have been identified by the Strengthening Families, Rebuild Hope publication, which came out at the end of the year. There was articles from the Kansas City Star and other resources if you would like some information about that. Number 2, we're going to explore how these problems create ethical dilemmas. The third objective, we'll introduce a tool, which is in section 2, how to screen when you have an ethical issue. And number 4, we'll be able to identify and differentiate the steps needed to help correct some of these problems. So kind of right out the gate, child welfare is really struggling. You and I would both agree with
Absolutely.
that. And it's not a new problem.
Absolutely.
And we're going to get into some of those problems. But I'd like to take a moment to share with you, these problems are held in place by norms. And these norms are what keeps social welfare and child welfare from changing. During an interview with a former KU professor, Yo Jackson, she's now at Penn State, she had shared with me that change is the enemy of child welfare. Change is the enemy. And we know as social workers, the pain of change has to be less than the pain of staying the same. Otherwise, you're just not going to change. Some of these norms that hold these problems in place include the notion that child welfare is the experts of the children that they serve in families. That's called adult centrism. In all reality, the only expert I am is of me and of my 4 sons and my wife, although she's the expert of all of us.
Absolutely.
And so it's quite a daunting task to think that I'm the expert of anyone else's children and families. But that's the default position child welfare takes. Another norm is blindly following best practices. And certainly we're going to talk a little bit about that. Making decisions without regard to best practice and believing that those procedures somehow are best practice. That is part of the problem. There's also been a huge wave of we're all trauma informed. A lot of agencies' mission statements will have statements where trauma informed. But if you're blindly following best practices and you're ignoring your client's expertise on them, there's no way you can be trauma informed. I mean, that's impossible. So these norms continue to hold these problems in place. And one of the goals of the Strengthen Families, Rebuild Hope research, documentation, and publication is for people like us, social workers, and our partners, counselors, marriage and family therapists, people who are in the capacity to help facilitate change, is to really hopefully break these norms. Because if these norms don't change, child welfare is not going to change.
Not at all.
So, any other thoughts about that before we wrap up this introduction section?
No, I think that was great. That was perfect.
All right. Welcome, and we're going to continue. Welcome back. This is section 2 for this webinar in regards to addressing the foster care crisis in Kansas. Before we continue on looking at 3 identified problems, we need to talk a little bit about how to frame ethics and ethical issues. As a social worker, when I'm struggling with an ethical dilemma, I run through a screening tool, and I teach it to my social work students and my supervisees. And so you start off looking at what is the extent of your knowledge of the Code of Ethics, and where you work, what is your agency's policies and procedures. And that's sort of a good starting point. Please remember, procedures and policies don't always line up in agencies. They do sometimes, and when they do, it's amazing. So I want to share this screening tool in the context of a case. It happens to be a child welfare case from the Missouri side, but it is an interesting case nonetheless. So the case is this. I am meeting with a 14-year-old boy in home. He is adopted out of foster care, and it's sort of a tune-up session. I hadn't met with them for a couple of months. They've been doing pretty well, and I'm starting my termination of the case. And I'm meeting with him and kind of going through how he's doing. And he shares with me that he's been using marijuana. And he's immediately scared, am I going to tell his mom? And so we had to have a conversation about confidentiality. And I shared with him, you know, I'm not going to tell your mom. I'm not a mandated reporter of a 14-year-old smoking marijuana. I don't personally feel good about it, but certainly it's not a mandated report. So, in looking at this screening tool, there are 8 steps. The first step is, what are your own values in regards to the dilemma? How do you personally feel? We're all individuals. We all have our own personal lens that we see our practice through. So how did I feel about a 14-year-old smoking marijuana? On a scale of 1 to 10, and a 10 would be the worst issue ever, you know, this is like a 2.5 or a 3. I mean, it's not the biggest issue ever. It's certainly concerning. Identify, number 2, societal values. Well, society isn't really thrilled about 14-year-olds smoking marijuana. So at this point, my personal value system and societal's value system, they're not really lining up. And the third is identify relevant professional values and ethics. So there is nothing in our Code of Ethics that says I have to report a 14-year-old getting high. I don't feel great about it. Society isn't a big fan about it. So in my session with my client, I asked the next question. Just out of curiosity, where are you getting your marijuana? And he kind of takes a breath and he shares with me that on his way home from school, he stops at the local convenience store, and at the convenience store, one of the employees sells marijuana kind of out of his car at the convenience store. And I asked my client, tell me a little bit about this guy. And he said, oh yeah, he's really old. He's like, 25 or something. And I kind of chuckled at that. So now the dilemma has changed. How do I feel personally about a 25-year-old selling marijuana to a minor? Yeah, I'm completely against that. How does society feel about that? Yeah, society would be completely against that. And then in regards to relevant ethics and values, yeah, the NASW Code of Ethics says I'm a mandated reporter of that. A 25-year-old selling marijuana to a 14-year-old is child abuse. It's criminal. So now the first three steps of the screen have perfectly lined up: my values, societal values, and my code of ethics. So I share with him, you know what, now we got to tell your mom. And so that's an example of how we begin a good ethics assessment screen. Step 4, we identify the alternative ethical actions that protect to the greatest extent. So what is it I need to do in this situation? Obviously, I'm a mandated reporter. I'm going to have to tell mom. We're going to have to bring mom into the session. You know, I can say to my client, do you want to tell your mom? You want me to be there with you? Do you want me to tell her and you're not there? Do you want us to do it together? Regardless, she's going to be told, right? And then from that decision, what do we do, you know, as a group? Some shared decision making. Do we call 911? Do we call child abuse hotline? Do we call the sheriff's office? You know, what is it that we do? Step 5, which alternatives will protect to the greatest extent? Your client, others, community, society. So what alternatives are going to be the best practice? Step 6, what can be done to minimize the conflicts between steps 1, 2, and 3? Again, as I shared, sometimes step 1, 2, and 3 don't always line up. Step 7, least harm, least restrictive. And step 8, weigh and consider both the short and long-term consequences of action or inaction. So I'm going to go ahead and post the screening tool up as a picture in the video so you can screenshot it if you have more interest about it, or you want to be able to practice using a screening tool. So thank you so much for section 2, and we'll be continuing in just a moment. Welcome back. So we're going to start by looking at the 3 problems, and we're going to break these sections down into each problem. The first problem is that too many Kansas children are in foster care, and they're coming in a racially disappropriate rates. So the statistics are staggering. From 2011 to 2018, kids coming into care and custody in Kansas rose 7% annually. The first time I read that statistic, I actually had to pull out my calculator and just double check the numbers. Each year it went up 7%. 7% in 2011, 2012, 2013, and each one of those numbers was larger than the previous year, so the rate of climb is exponential. In fact, in 2016, Kansas ranked 43rd out of 50 states for kids coming into care per the population, and that's really sad and heartbreaking. The other issue, and Tara's going to talk a little bit about this, is in regards to the kids that are coming in, for the most part, are not white kids.
Absolutely. The Kansas African American Foster Care and Adoption Coalition was started in response to statistics that said that disproportionately African American children are put into foster care more than any other ethnicity. And I served on the Governor's Child Welfare System Task Force, and one of the things that we learned from Teresa Markowitz with the Annie E. Casey Foundation is that if you are an African American child living in Kansas, the child welfare system does not work for you. And so that is something that significantly needs to be addressed, because in 2017, African Americans were 75% more likely than white children to be placed in foster care.
I happened to watch a really amazing TED Talk this fall from a professor and researcher out of Florida named Jessica Price. I would encourage you to Google this on YouTube and find this TED Talk. And she talks about the implicit bias. Some people have already made their decision to take kids into care and custody by zip code alone. They get the referral in, they see what part of town it is in Topeka or Olathe, Kansas, or in Wichita, and they already in their mind decide it's a bad situation, it's a bad family, the kids are in abuse, they need to be removed. Because again, back to that norm, we're the experts of these kids and families, we know what's best for them. And that's that implicit bias. So if you have that opportunity to go find that TED Talk, I think you would really benefit from it. Again, her name is Jessica Price. So all of this accumulates in the fact that kids are coming into Kansas 7% increased annually for 7 years, but they're not leaving at that same rate.
Wow.
So
That's huge.
kids are coming in at high rates and they're leaving at low rates. So more and more kids just continue to enter the system. And it's not really supposed to be like that.
It's not. It's really, really not. And something's broken in that there's a door that's moving faster on one end than it is on the other. And that's a big part of the problem.
Big part of the problem. So because this is an ethics workshop, we want to take each section and tie it back to the Code of Ethics. So Tara and I both agree that I think our starting place is in Section 1 in the Code of Ethics, which is our ethical responsibility to clients. And we are, by the way, looking at the NASW Code of Ethics that was updated at the end of 2017 and went into effect in January of 2018. So if you're not aware that the ethics have changed, that's another workshop that you need to do, and we're not offering that one today.
No, not today.
So looking at informed consent, which is 1.03. Social workers should provide clients with an opportunity to ask questions. Does that mean 10-year-olds should be able to ask questions, or 14-year-olds?
Anyone that's being served by a social worker should be able to
Yeah,
ask questions.
absolutely anyone. In fact, the code goes on in subsection C to state, in instances when clients lack the capacity to provide informed consent, social workers should protect the client's interests by seeking permission from an appropriate third party. That's not us, right?
No.
If I'm the social worker and I'm looking to remove that kid, what's the appropriate third party?
Appropriate third party is someone outside of that situation who has an unbiased perspective of what's going on and what needs to happen.
Yeah, and in some instances that includes the family.
Absolutely.
Right, an auntie,
Absolutely.
kinship placement. And how often do we never follow this code?
Wow. I'm afraid to find out.
I don't even want to know.
I'm afraid.
I don't
afraid
even
to
want to
ask.
know.
I'm afraid.
Subsection D, in regards to informed consent, says, in instances when clients are receiving services involuntary, which is pretty much every kid in child
Absolutely.
welfare, social workers should provide information about the nature and extent of services and about the extent of the client's right to refuse the service.
That never happens.
No one sits down and has a conversation with Johnny.
No.
Right, he's 10 years old. He's come into care and custody because of allegations of child abuse, which is a shame, right? So yeah. So if you have any thoughts about that code of ethics, I am going to put a link in the video so that you can read more about Section 1.03, informed consent, subsections A, C, and D. So thank you so much. We're going to continue on to problem number 2. Welcome back. We're moving on to problem 2. Kansas children are staying in foster care far too long, and they often experience dangerously high instability in their placements. So one of the statistics that really speaks to me in regards to this problem, in regards to the report by Strengthening Families Rebuild Hope, is the notion of how many moves occur within 1,000 days. So the Child and Family Review Service Review Standard, which is a federal standard, is 4.1. 4.1 moves in 1,000 days. In Kansas, the statistics are 9.9, and that's the average. Please understand there are outliers where children are moved in 1,000 days 100 times. Now that sounds like science fiction, but it's not, unfortunately. It is occurring. So I want to take just a moment to talk about the ramifications of moving 9.9 times in 1,000 days. That means, let's just say you're moving foster home to foster home. That is 9 different families, 9 different moms or parental figures, 9 different sets of children. Each one you leave behind is a loss. And one of the things that Tara and I, as we're kind of preparing for this webinar on a phone conference we talked about, is we both know every single move creates an adversity for the the child. And we know what the research study from Kaiser Permanente and the CDC in regards to ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. We know that every move increases their ACEs score. So if being in child welfare is to protect the children and help them get stability in their lives, but all we're doing is making their ACEs score worse, then how is that even at all an ethical practice? And that is pretty concerning to me, that in essence child welfare is not making kids better and maybe making kids worse. So tell us a little bit about what does that do to education?
For children who are in custody and are moved from place to place to place, there is a law in place, the McKinney-Vento Act, that allows children to remain in their home school. That does not always happen and results in children moving from school to school. Their records are not updated because they've only been at one school at a short period of time. They move to the next school, and before they get settled, get testing, get caught up to wherever their school is, it's time to move again. And that results in significant trauma in their academic history, not to mention the fact that, let's face it, kids are kids. You go to school, you show up one day, and chances are somebody knows you're in foster care. And so that whole stigma that's attached to that, then the kid goes to school, they don't necessarily want to pay attention, they don't want to be involved in anything, and because they know at the end of the day, they're not going home like their peers are. They don't know where they're going. I have experienced kids on my caseload that will go to school, get picked up from school, go to the placing agency's office and stay there until a resource has been identified for them to sleep that night. They get up in the morning, they go to school again, and go back to the placing agency's office for another home. And what's striking to me, we discussed it, is that a move is not defined as that kind of situation. A move is defined as a change in an established placement for a child. So the fact that you spent the night at this house and then went to a different house the next night does not count as a placement for you. It's a move. Physically, you are moving and you're leaving behind this family that you spent, 4 hours getting to know, went to sleep, got up the next morning, and then you're gone. Trauma doesn't recognize that an establishment has to take place. Trauma recognizes that there's a part of that child that's left behind every single time they move.
Which means, in essence, the system has made the child homeless.
Absolutely.
The other thing which is really powerful, as a social worker or counselor or marriage and family therapist watching this webinar, and your own knowledge of trauma, if you think a little bit about Bowlby and Bowlby's theories of attachment, Bowlby said the threat of loss is equal to loss.
Absolutely.
So if every single day you go to school, but you don't know where you're going to be that night, that's just more and more loss. Your ACEs score just keeps going up and up. Mm-hmm. So, wow, that is just mind-blowing. So let's take a look at the code of ethics in regards to this issue. So I think really the best place to go here is our commitment to clients, which again is in section 1, our responsibility to our client. 1.01, our commitments to clients. And I'd like to just take a moment to read this first sentence for you. Social workers' primary responsibility is to promote the well-being of clients. What exactly does that mean to you?
That means that everything that I do involving that client should be centered around the fact that it represents my attempts to promote that well-being for that child or that family. And that may include me questioning someone above me to say, is this in the best interest of this child? Because we're doing more harm than good.
I don't know if you're familiar with a project called Signs of Safety. Signs of Safety does something which I think is really powerful if you implement it correctly, and that is on any decision that's being made for a client, the social worker is to ask the question, am I maybe doing this wrong?
Mm-hmm.
Am I maybe hurting the client?
Mm-hmm.
What if I am wrong? So this particular code of ethics 1.01, that's what it says. It's the well-being of the client. We have to stop and ask ourselves, is this best practice decision really the well-being of the client? In one of my recent papers for one of my graduate students at the university, they wrote a paper about a sibling split that occurred.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a sibling group of three, a 14-year-old boy, a couple of girls much younger, and the decision was made not because of best practice. There is no best practice to sibling split. It was made out of convenience. The foster adoptive parent didn't want to adopt the 14-year-old boy, and so the sibling split was made. And a room full of social workers made that decision. Again, adult centrism.
Wow.
Nobody asked the kids what they want.
Wow.
And how is that in the long-term well-being of clients? And we're not even going to go into the research that supports the sibling relationship
Absolutely.
the rest of your life.
Mm-hmm.
So ethical dilemmas everywhere.
Absolutely.
So,
Absolutely.
all right. Welcome back. We're moving on to problem number 3 as identified in this report, Strengthening Families and Rebuilding Hope. Problem number 3, it is too difficult for Kansas children in foster care to find permanency. So one statistic I do think it's important for us to mention, on an average, the research says kids coming into care and custody in Kansas are staying in custody for 21.1 months. So just shy of 2 years, and that's the average, which means there are outliers out there that are huge. So we've already talked about the value of permanency and the threat of loss equals loss, and each move increases, loss in a child's life. So when kids are not finding permanency, are best practice standards being followed? What do you think about that?
I would hazard a guess to say in many cases, probably not. Decisions are made for families and children based on, as you said, what is convenient or what works in the moment. And even after those decisions are made, there's not always stability. And what's the likelihood that the child ends up back in the foster care system? With chances are they're going to end up in longer the next time.
One of the things I am optimistic, but we have yet to see how this is going to play out, is the changes in funding for foster care. For far too long in foster care, and we do believe, right, that not everyone is going to watch this webinar has been works with children and families. We get that. We hope that the most of the people who are watching this work with other populations, but this is so interesting to them that they're willing to do some advocacy work. But we also want to touch every social worker that works with children and families as well. But if you're not aware of funding in child welfare, it works like this. There is very little federal funding for prevention. The funding is for when kids come into state custody, which means that states draw down federal funds when kids come into custody. So granted, there have been some funding changes, and again, as I mentioned, we have yet to see how it's going to play out. But there was no advantage to do prevention. There was no financial incentive to do prevention. States draw down money the more kids they have in child welfare to treat them, rather than trying to prevent. So the Council of Social Work Education has 12 grand challenges. One of those grand challenges, if you're not familiar with any of them, I'd encourage you to look into them. But one of those grand challenges is called Ensuring the Healthy Development of Youth. And in that grand challenge, one of the thesis, and there's an open paper that is continuing to be worked on, which says that prevention is the key. Prevention works better than treatment after removal. We could do more. There's more of a benefit to do prevention. So some of the changes in the funding, which again, we have yet to see how it's going to roll out, is that there's going to be more funding for prevention, which would include things like family preservation, intensive in-home services, But it'll be exciting to see how those things roll out.
Absolutely.
So, looking at the ethics, we want to switch gears a little bit here. We want to move to Section 4 of the Code of Ethics. So, Section 4, right out of the gate, 4.01, subsection C says social workers should base practice on recognized knowledge, including empirically based knowledge, relevant to social work and social work ethics. So, are best practice standards being followed?
In some instances, I believe that they are. What's challenging is that not every family and not every child falls under that criteria for best practices. It's
Right, because a best practice for a family of color could be very different than for a best practice family
Absolutely.
for a family of that isn't of color.
Absolutely.
Or religion, or
Absolutely.
What country they're from or what language they speak.
And that plays into the competence. It's not just, many people, I'm big on cultural competence. It's not just the color of someone's skin that makes cultural competence what it is. It's so many factors. It's how they live in their homes. If you walk in a home and there's no furniture, that doesn't mean they're poor. That doesn't mean they can't afford furniture. That may be their practice. And you have to understand and learn as much as you can in order to do that, instead of just walking in and applying your own personal biases and all of that to that family situation, which results in typically individuals being removed from their home.
This is a struggle that I see in a lot of young social workers, and that is one, our own biases and value systems playing into this, but also you walk into a home that doesn't have furniture, you immediately think neglect.
Absolutely.
And in all reality, not everybody has 2.5 couches and a beanbag chair and a dining room table. But that doesn't mean the families aren't nurturing and loving and caring families.
Very true.
So one of the significant changes, I think, to the Code of Ethics in 2017 as it rolled into 2018 is that it's no longer cultural competency, it is now cultural awareness. Because there's no way I can be competent in 1,000 cultures. And so we have that responsibility to be culturally aware. And back to this ethics, our practice should be based on knowledge, empirically based decisions, evidence-based practice, best practices. So when we're making decisions that aren't best practice, or we think they are because they're blindly following best practices, then we're operating outside of the Code of Ethics.
Absolutely.
And it's certainly a dilemma at that point. So I think that's one of the best changes in the Code of Ethics, is that shift from cultural competency to cultural awareness. So if you read that paragraph, there's a lot of little changes in language, which is really important. The very last sentence is, it used to be disability, but now it's ability. That is really powerful. So,
that's helpful. That's helpful to children and families.
All right. All right, now that we've covered the 3 problems as identified in the Strengthening Families, Rebuilding Hope publication, we'd be remiss not to have a dialogue about a few more ethical areas that I think are really relevant when we think about the problems in child welfare in Kansas. Number 1, moving on into the Code of Ethics, Section 6, Social and Political Action. Social workers should act to expand choice and opportunity for all people, with special regard for those that are marginalized, vulnerable, disadvantaged, oppressed, and exploited people. All of us have a responsibility for advocacy. I know a lot of people that are in social work school, they want to be therapists. That's great, we need good therapists. But every social worker has a responsibility for advocacy, which means you have a responsibility to ask hard questions that sometimes don't have easy answers. And you have to be willing to ask the hard question, because if you don't, right, then you just become part of the problem.
And
right?
who eventually asks that question? As a social worker, I tell people all the time, sometimes we have to be the troublemakers. We have to be the people that make those difficult statements and call things to people's attention. Otherwise, it's never going to be addressed. We have to do that.
Yeah, we have to do that. And it isn't one of those pick and choose, right?
No.
I do say this, when it comes time to advocacy, this is sort of just a recommendation from an old social worker. You can't win every battle, right? So you do have to choose your battles carefully. But if you're not doing any advocacy and asking hard questions, if you're in a family support team meeting and you suddenly realize confidentiality is being violated, you've got to say, time out. Can I ask a question about confidentiality? I don't mean to slow down the process here, but I have this responsibility. So, and then last but not least is the value and dignity and worth of the person. Surely you're familiar with the Code of Ethics. By the way, Counselor's Code of Ethics, Marriage and Family Therapist Code of Ethics aren't much different than us as social workers. I've had the opportunity to study all of those codes. All of them are based on very similar values and principles. We have a set of values, and one of those is the dignity and worth of a person. Social workers respect the inherent dignity and worth of the person, and there's some really key things in that value statement. Number one, the responsibility to respect self-determination. That, by the way, is really hard for social workers. It means not everybody makes the right choice, but you still have to accept the choice that they make. I mean, if you had a client make a decision that you didn't like, all the time, you have clients that are
Absolutely, I do.
maybe getting high or running away. You don't love that decision, but it's still their right to that decision.
And I have to respect them, and I have to respect that decision.
The other key thing is that we should seek to enhance clients' capacity. I like to see it as a coach. The coach doesn't run in and do the plays for the players. The coach is the motivator. The coach will work as hard as the players. But for me, I don't work harder than my clients, with the exception of safety and suicide awareness and suicidal ideation. But aside from that, my goal in life is to be fired. Not because I did a bad job, but because they don't need you and I anymore.
I tell my clients that all the time. My goal is for you to not need me in your life. That means we've both done what it is we're supposed to do.
Absolutely. I think that is really powerful. So again, I'm going to post links in regards to these codes on a title page in between each section. So we do want you to be familiar with your code, whether you're a counselor or a marriage and family therapist, and also as a social worker, and go back and make sure, because you have that responsibility. No one is going to make you do it. It's yours to do. We just wanted this webinar to be a little bit interesting and be topic focused and specific. So we're going to shift gears here, and we're going to talk about some recommendations from this report by Strengthening Families and Rebuilding Hope. So. All right, we're moving into our final section. Our final section is to talk about some of the recommendations from this report, and certainly there'll be a link to a PDF if you like a copy of the report. That's pretty easy to do. So we've looked at ethics from Section 1 in the Code of Ethics, Section 4 in the Code of Ethics, Section 6, and some of the just inherent values of being a social worker. The problems in child welfare are relevant ethical dilemmas and considerations. So there are 3 recommendations from Strengthening Families, Rebuilding Hope. The first one is supporting families by ensuring they have resources necessary to take care of their children and avoid contact with the foster care system. Because once you get into the system,
it's kind of hard to get out.
It's kind of hard to get out. So one of the recommendations is more resources. An example of that could be TANF funding. Number 2, once children do become known to the Kansas Department for Children and Families through reports and investigations, Kansas needs to focus on more targeted prevention and early intervention. As we shared in a previous segment, There have been some changes in the federal guidelines for foster care, and we're not really sure how they're going to play out, but the focus is prevention. Again, in the Council on Social Work Education Grand Challenge, Ensuring the Healthy Development of Youth, the research is very clear: prevention works. It works regardless of region, environment, race, gender. It works, rather than waiting till the bus falls off. I've always thought of that silly example. This community has this cliff and the kids keep falling off the cliff. So we should do something about it. So the community gets together, they have town hall meetings, and they decide to build a hospital at the base of the cliff.
Wow.
Instead of maybe putting a fence up to keep kids from falling off the cliff. It's kind of a silly analogy, but that's kind of where we're at. And number 3, Kansas needs to improve conditions for youth in foster care. Placement stability needs to be improved. 9.9 moves as an average is unacceptable.
That's way too high.
I'm not even sure that 4.1 moves is acceptable in 1,000 days. It's not acceptable. It causes problems. It causes adverse childhood experiences to go up, exposure to trauma, loss, as we've talked about at length, educational issues. It's just unacceptable. And so one of the things that we've got to do is we've got to improve the safety net for our children and families. We've got to respect that they are experts on their own lives. We've got to address the implicit biases that occur from zip codes. Not everybody that lives in a certain zip code in Topeka are neglectful, bad people. We've got to be willing to ask these really hard questions and be willing to have some really hard discussions. Do you have any thoughts as we start to wrap up?
I think we've covered a great deal of information here, and we're going to have people coming back at us with questions, I'm sure, and we'll provide a way for individuals to ask those questions, and we'll check back with the video once it's posted and everything to respond to those questions. But I feel really, really good about the information that we've shared, and hopefully we've helped somebody, empowered somebody, and encouraged somebody to do different things and to think about things differently when you encounter children and families in the child welfare system.
Absolutely. Doing what's right isn't always easy.
No.
And I tell people doing what's right is frequently kind of chunky and kind of crunchy. It's not smooth like, French silk chocolate pie. It's just not always going to be like that, right?
And not everybody likes
French silk chocolate pie. Maybe you like pecan pie or cherry pie. But it's not always that smooth, and we've got to be really willing. And so one last kind of silly analogy, but I think it really speaks to what we're talking about. And then we're going to give you some instruction. Mm-hmm. So Kansas has failed over 50% of the federal guidelines. The report came out in August. It looked at June to July or maybe it was July to June of 2017 into 2018. Kansas failed over 50% of the federal guidelines. If a restaurant that you loved failed 50% of their health code violations, it wouldn't be there anymore.
No.
Your favorite restaurant would be gone. You wouldn't even want to go to that restaurant. If a sports team loses 50% of their games, they get new coaches. Mm-hmm. They get new players.
They make huge changes.
They make huge changes. And child welfare?
Nothing.
Nothing. We need to start asking these hard questions.
Yeah.
I know that's a silly analogy, but if that's the only thing that you get out of this workshop, then by all means, there you go. So here are some instructions. At the end of this workshop, down at the bottom of this YouTube feed, there are some links. Again, a link for the Strengthening Families report. Please take it, read it, pass it on, share it. If you're an adjunct teacher somewhere at a bachelor's level or a psychology class, please share it with your students. It is peer reviewed, it has resources, it is an excellent tool. Also, in order to get credit for this, you need to log into SurveyMonkey and take a short survey. They will ask you for your email address because when you are finished, then Strength Families Rebuild Hope will then shoot you a certificate for 1 hour CEU for ethics. Please remember you need 3 hours of ethics CEUs every 2 years. So this certainly gets you along
There
that
you
path.
go. Jumpstart.
So, absolutely. Anything else as we close out?
No, I think it's great.
All right. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we look forward to hearing your feedback, your questions. Did this platform work for you? Maybe you want to sit in the third chair with us next time. We'd
There
love
you
that. So signing off. Have a great rest of the day.
Yes.